The night was alive with chaos, the sky split by jagged bolts of lightning as rain lashed against the trembling earth. Beneath the furious storm, a young seer named Kale knelt in the mud, his hands trembling as they brushed away centuries of dirt from a stone tablet. The markings were ancient, their curves and lines pulsing faintly with an otherworldly glow. This was no ordinary artifact. It was a prophecy, one that spoke of the runes of destiny, relics said to hold the power to grant eternal sleep, a gift that could save his village from an invasion looming on the horizon. But as Kale traced the symbols with trembling fingers, a chill crept into his bones. The storm roared louder, as if warning him of the darkness that lay ahead. What price would the runes demand, and could he bear it? Where are you joining us from, and what time is it there? Let us know in the comments, because tonight, as Kale begins his journey, we're all part of this tale. The runes of destiny are calling, and their whispers are far more than they seem. Kale's journey to the ruins of the ancient temple was no simple trek. Guided by fragmented legends passed down through generations, he ventured deep into the wilderness, where the air grew heavy with an unshakable sense of foreboding. The stories spoke of a temple hidden by time, its entrance concealed beneath layers of ivy and stone. But as Kale approached, the path seemed to shift beneath his feet, as if the land itself was testing his resolve. It was there, amidst the whispering trees and the faint glow of twilight, that he first encountered Lyra, a traveler cloaked in shadows. Her presence was as enigmatic as the ruins themselves. Her voice, low and urgent, carried a warning that lingered in the air like a haunting melody. "The runes you seek are not merely keys to salvation," she said, her eyes piercing through the dim light. "They are bound by a curse, one that has claimed the lives of those who dare to wield their power." Kale hesitated, her words echoing in his mind. The weight of his village suffering pressed heavily upon him, yet Lyra's warning planted a seed of doubt. Could he risk everything for a power shrouded in such darkness? But duty called louder than fear. Kale pressed on, driven by the belief that the runes were his only hope to save his people. As he reached the temple's entrance, a spectral figure materialized before him, its form shifting like mist in the wind. The guardian's voice was a low rumble, demanding Kale prove his worth. "Speak the answer to this riddle," it intoned, "or turn back and forsake your quest." The riddle was cryptic, its words a labyrinth of meaning, yet Kale, with a mind sharpened by years of deciphering ancient texts, pieced together the answer. The spectral figure dissolved, granting him passage into the temple's depths. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of age and the faint hum of energy. The hidden chamber revealed itself in a breathtaking display. Runes etched into the walls glowed with an otherworldly light, their symbols pulsing like a heartbeat. But as Kale stepped forward, the ground trembled beneath him. From the shadows emerged a towering guardian, its eyes blazing with an ancient fury. The runes were within reach, but so too was the danger they awakened. Kale stood at the precipice of discovery, his heart racing as he realized the true cost of his quest. The runes held the power to save his village, but at what cost? The guardian's roar echoed through the chamber, a stark reminder that some secrets were never meant to be uncovered. The air was thick with tension as Kale and Lira sprinted through the crumbling temple corridors, their footsteps echoing against the ancient stone. Behind them, the towering guardian roared, its massive form shaking the walls with every step. Just when it seemed the creature would overtake them, Lyra grabbed Kael's arm, pulling him into a hidden alcove. Her voice was barely a whisper, but her words carried urgency. "Stay still, don't breathe," the guardian thundered past, its glowing eyes scanning the shadows. Kale clutched the rune tightly in his hand, the faint hum of its power vibrating through his fingers. It had been a reckless move to snatch it from the altar, but something about the rune had called to him, a whisper in his mind, soft yet insistent. Now, as they crouched in the darkness, that whisper grew louder, promising strength, wisdom, and answers to questions he hadn't even asked. But beneath the promises, there was something darker, a faint undercurrent of doubt, as if the rune were testing him, probing his resolve. Lyra's sharp gaze fell on the rune, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have taken it," she said, her tone a mix of frustration and concern. "These runes are not meant to be wielded lightly. They carry a price." Kale frowned, his grip tightening. "And what would you know about them?" He shot back, his voice edged with suspicion. Lyra hesitated, then sighed. "More than you might think. I am a descendant of the Guardians, the ones who first bound these runes to protect them from those who would misuse their power." Her revelation stunned him. She had been a stranger, a guide through the temple's traps, but now she stood before him as something far more, a descendant of the very beings who had created these artifacts. Yet, as much as her words explained, they also raised more questions. Why had she kept this hidden, and what did she truly want? Kale's trust in her wavered, but with the Guardian still roaming the halls and the rune's whispers growing louder, he had little choice but to rely on her. As they slipped out of the temple and into the pale light of dawn, the rune's influence began to take root. Kale felt its power coursing through him, sharpening his senses and heightening his strength. But with it came a creeping unease, a sense that the rune was not just a tool, but something alive, watching, waiting. Lyra noticed the change in him, her eyes narrowing. "Be careful," she warned. "The runes don't just give power. They take something in return. Don't let it consume you." Before Kale could respond, shadowy figures emerged from the trees, their forms cloaked in darkness. Their leader stepped forward, his voice a low growl. "Hand over the rune, and we might let you live." Kale's heart raced, the runes hummed now a steady pulse in his chest. He glanced at Lyra, who nodded grimly. They were outnumbered, but the rune's power surged within him, tempting him to unleash it. As the figures closed in, Kale realized the true danger wasn't just the strangers before him. It was the rune itself, and the way it was weaving itself into his very being, blurring the line between ally and adversary. The clash was swift and brutal. Kale and Lyra moved as one, their blades cutting through the night with practiced precision. The attackers, though numerous, were no match for their combined skill. Yet in the chaos, a blade found its mark. Kale staggered, clutching his side as blood seeped through his fingers. Lyra rushed to his side, her eyes wide with fear, but before she could act, the rune on his arm began to glow. A soft, golden light enveloped him, knitting his wound closed as if it had never been. But the cost was clear. Kale's face paled, his strength ebbing as though the rune had drained him instead of healed. Lyra's voice cut through the quiet that followed. Kale, this power, it's not just healing you, it's changing you. I've seen it before. Ancient magic like this doesn't give without taking something in return. Her words were heavy, laced with a warning she hoped he would heed. But Kale shook his head, his jaw set with determination. We don't have a choice, he said, his voice steady despite his weariness. If this is what it takes to save my village, then I'll bear it. We need this power, Lyra. You know we do. Reluctantly, she agreed, though her unease lingered like a shadow. Together, they turned their sights to the cursed forest, a place whispered about in hushed tones by travelers and villagers alike. It was said that the trees there held secrets, echoes of the past that could drive the unwary to madness. As they approached the forest's edge, the air seemed to thicken, the usual sounds of nature fading into an eerie silence. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just a heavy stillness that pressed against their chests. The forest loomed before them, its ancient trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Kale hesitated for a moment, his hand tightening around the hilt of his sword. Lyra glanced at him, her expression unreadable, but she said nothing. Together, they stepped into the gloom, the weight of the silence wrapping around them like a shroud. The deeper they ventured, the more the forest seemed to close in, its secrets whispering just beyond the edge of hearing. The rune on Kale's arm pulsed faintly, as if responding to the unseen forces around them, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching, waiting. As Kale and Lyra ventured deeper into the ancient forest, the air grew heavy with an eerie stillness, and the trees seemed to close in around them. Shadows danced at the edges of their vision, and whispers, faint but insistent, began to echo through the underbrush. It wasn't long before the forest revealed its true nature, a place where reality bent, and the mind's deepest fears took shape. Kale froze as the world around him shifted. The familiar sights of his village appeared before him, but something was horribly wrong. Flames engulfed the homes he once knew, and the cries of his people pierced the air. Among the chaos, he saw faces he loved as family. His friends turned toward him with accusing eyes. "This is your doing," they seemed to say, their voices a chorus of anguish and blame. The weight of their judgment pressed down on him, threatening to crush his resolve. Lyra, too, found herself ensnared in the forest's illusions. Before her stretched a vision of the past, a time when her ancestors stood as guardians of the runes. But their strength had faltered, and the runes were lost, plunging the world into chaos. She felt their shame, their regret, as if it were her own. The burden of their failure clung to her, whispering that she, too, would fall short. For a moment, Kale stood paralyzed, his heart pounding as the visions tightened their grip. But then, he felt the rune at his side, a faint pulse of warmth, cutting through the cold dread. Summoning its power, he focused on the energy coursing through him, and with a surge of determination, shattered the illusions. The flames and voices vanished, leaving only the quiet of the forest. Yet, as the rune's glow faded, he couldn't shake the unease that lingered in its wake. Lyra watched him closely, her expression a mix of relief and concern. She had seen the way the rune's power surged through him, how it seemed to pull him deeper into its embrace. "Kale," she began, her voice steady but laced with worry. "We must be careful. The rune's influence is growing stronger, and I fear it may lead us down a path we cannot turn back from. Their partnership, once united by a shared purpose, now carried an undercurrent of tension. Kale's growing reliance on the rune's power clashed with Lyra's instinctive distrust of its influence. Yet, there was no time to dwell on their differences. As they pressed deeper into the forest, a distant sound reached their ears, a rhythmic, haunting beat of drums that seemed to echo through the trees. The drums carried an ancient, primal energy, as if the forest itself were alive and watching. Each beat resonated with a sense of foreboding, yet also a strange, magnetic pull. Kale and Lyra exchanged a glance, their unspoken questions hanging in the air. What awaited them deeper in the forest, and could they face it together, or would the rune's growing hold on Kale drive them apart? The rhythmic pounding of drums echoed through the dense forest, drawing Kale and Lyra deeper into its shadowed heart. The sound was primal, pulsing like the heartbeat of the earth itself, guiding them to a hidden glade bathed in an otherworldly glow. There, beneath a canopy of ancient trees, a tribe of forest dwellers moved in perfect harmony, their bodies swaying to the cadence of the drums. They were guardians, their ritual a living prayer to protect the second rune of destiny. At the center stood their leader, Thalia, a woman whose presence radiated both strength and mystery. Her piercing gaze locked onto Kale as she stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of the forest itself. "You seek the rune," she said, her tone neither welcoming nor hostile. "But power without purpose is a dangerous thing. To prove your worth, you must face a trial of spirit. Only then will the rune reveal itself to you." Kale hesitated, his mind racing. He had faced physical challenges before, battles against monstrous creatures and treacherous terrain. But this was something else entirely. Still, he nodded, his resolve hardening. "I accept," he said, though a flicker of doubt lingered in his eyes. The tribe formed a circle around him, their chanting rising in intensity. Thalia raised her hands, and the glade seemed to shift, the air thickening with energy. Suddenly, Kale was no longer standing in the forest. He was back in his village, watching his family from a distance. The memory was vivid, almost tangible. He saw his younger self, torn between duty and desire, choosing to leave everything behind in pursuit of the runes. The guilt he had buried resurfaced, raw and unrelenting. As he relived the moment, he turned his back on those he loved. "I couldn't stay," Kale whispered, his voice trembling. "I had to follow the path, but why? Was it worth it?" The weight of his choices pressed down on him, threatening to crush his spirit. He stumbled, his resolve wavering. It was Lyra who broke through the haze of his despair. She stepped into the vision, her presence a lifeline. "Kale," she said, her voice soft but firm, "guilt can either chain you or teach you. I know what it's like to carry pain, to question every decision, but you can't let it consume you. Balance is the key, not just between strength and weakness, but between the past and the future." Her words struck a chord within him. Kale took a deep breath, steadying himself. He looked at his family one last time, not with regret, but with acceptance. "I carry them with me," he said aloud, his voice stronger now. "Their love, their sacrifices, they're part of who I am." The vision faded, and Kale found himself back in the glade, the tribe's chanting replaced by a profound silence. Thalia nodded, a hint of approval in her eyes. "You have faced your spirit and emerged unbroken," she said. "The rune is yours." As she spoke, the second rune materialized, its surface glowing faintly. But as Kale reached for it, a whisper slithered into his mind, faint but insistent. It promised power, absolute, unyielding power. Visions flashed before him, kingdoms bowing at his feet, enemies crumbling with a gesture, the world reshaped by his will. The temptation was intoxicating, and for a moment, Kale felt the pull, the allure of becoming something more than mortal. Lyra's hand on his shoulder brought him back. "Don't lose yourself," she warned, her voice cutting through the whispers. "The runes test us in ways we can't always see. Stay true to who you are." Kale nodded, but the whispers lingered, a shadow in the corners of his mind. The rune was his, but the cost of wielding it was becoming clearer. The journey was far from over, and the path ahead would demand more than strength. It would demand wisdom. The air grew heavier as Kale and Lyra emerged from the forest, the second rune now safely tucked away. Its glow pulsed faintly against Kale's chest, a reminder of the power they carried. Thalia's warning echoed in their minds. A darkness was rising, one that hungered for the runes and the ancient magic they held. But even as they pressed forward, Kale found his thoughts drifting, his focus narrowing to the whispers that seemed to come from the runes themselves. Soft, insistent voices that promised him the ability to change everything, to reshape the world as he saw fit. Lyra noticed the shift in him almost immediately. The way his gaze grew distant, his steps more deliberate. She tried to reason with him, her voice steady but laced with concern. "Kale, we can't let the runes dictate our choices. They're powerful, but they're not meant to be wielded lightly." Yet Kale barely seemed to hear her. The whispers grew louder, more persuasive. They spoke of order, of strength, of a world free from chaos, a world he could create. His trust in Lyra began to fray, her words sounding more like doubt than wisdom. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice low and tense. "This power, it's not just for us, it's for everyone." Before Lyra could respond, the shadows around them shifted. Figures emerged from the gloom, their forms indistinct but menacing. The same shadowy pursuers from before, relentless in their hunt. Kale's hand instinctively went to the runes, his fingers curling around them as if they were an extension of himself. The air crackled with energy, and before Lyra could stop him, he unleashed their power. A blinding surge of light erupted, tearing through the shadows and leaving destruction in its wake. Trees splintered, the ground scorched, and the figures dissolved into nothingness. When the light faded, the landscape was altered, scarred by the force of the rune's magic. Lyra stared in shock, her heart pounding. This wasn't control, this was chaos. She turned to Kale, her voice trembling but firm. "Do you see what's happening? This power, it's changing you. We have to find a way to stop it before it's too late." But Kale's face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the destruction he had caused. The whispers in his mind were louder now, drowning out her words. They were running out of time, not just to stop the darkness chasing them, but to save Kale from the rune's growing hold. And Lyra knew, with a sinking certainty, that the greatest threat might not be the shadows at their heels, but the danger within their own ranks. The path ahead was uncertain, the stakes higher than ever. and as they moved forward, the weight of their choices pressed down on them, a reminder that every step brought them closer to either salvation or ruin. The air grew heavy as Kale and Lyra stepped into the desolate wasteland, their boots crunching against brittle earth that seemed to groan beneath their weight. The horizon stretched endlessly, a lifeless expanse of cracked soil and jagged rock, where the sun hung low and dull, casting long shadows over the barren terrain. The scent of decay clung to the air, a haunting reminder of the land's slow, inevitable death. Kale's chest tightened as he felt the pull of the runes grow stronger, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. It was as if the land itself whispered to him, its voice both alluring and ominous. Lyra glanced at him, her sharp eyes narrowing as she noticed the distant look on his face. "Kale," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness. "You're drifting again. Tell me what you're seeing." He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if it held something only he could perceive. "A world," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "A world where I stand above all, where the runes bend to my will. I could shape reality itself, Lyra. I could be more than I am." Her expression hardened, and she stepped in front of him, forcing him to meet her eyes. "That's not why we're here," she said firmly. "This isn't about power. It's about balance. Remember who you are." But the visions clouded his mind, vivid and intoxicating. He saw himself towering over nations, his hand outstretched as the runes swirled around him like obedient stars. The world bowed to his command, and he felt invincible, untouchable. Lyra's voice pierced through the haze, sharp and urgent. "Kale, snap out of it," she shouted, her hands gripping his shoulders. He recoiled, his eyes flashing with anger as he pushed her away. For a moment, his hand twitched toward the hilt of his blade, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Lyra didn't flinch, her gaze steady even as her heart raced. "Is this what you want?" she demanded. "To become the very thing we're trying to stop?" Her words struck him like a blow, and he staggered back, the fire in his eyes dimming as reality crashed over him. "No," he whispered, his voice thick with shame. "No, that's not who I am." He turned away, his hands trembling as he fought to regain control. Lyra watched him, her expression softening but her resolve unshaken. "We're in this together," she said quietly, "but only if you stay true to yourself." As they pressed forward, the ruins of a forgotten city emerged from the haze, its crumbling towers and shattered walls standing as silent witnesses to a lost era. The third rune lay hidden somewhere within, its power calling to Kale with an intensity that made his head swim. But as they approached, a low, guttural growl echoed through the ruins, sending a chill down their spines. From the shadows emerged a monstrous creature, its form twisted and unnatural, a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and stone. Its eyes glowed with the same corrupted energy that pulsed from the rune, a dark reminder of the cost of unchecked power. Kale and Lyra exchanged a glance, their earlier tension replaced by a shared determination. "Ready?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. He nodded, gripping his weapon tightly. "Let's finish this." The creature lunged, its roar shaking the very ground beneath their feet, and the battle began, a clash not just for the rune, but for the soul of the world itself. The air crackled with tension as Kale and Lyra faced the monstrous creature, its shadowy form shifting unnaturally in the dim light. They raised the runes, chanting the ancient words that had brought them victory before, but this time, nothing happened. The creature roared, unfazed, its jagged claws slashing through the air. Panic flickered in Kale's eyes as he realized the rune's power was useless here. For the first time in years, he'd have to rely on something deeper, his own strength, his own instincts. It was a jarring reminder of who he'd been before the runes had defined him. Lyra, ever the strategist, saw an opening. With a fierce cry, she lunged forward, drawing the creature's attention away from Kale. Her movements were precise, almost graceful, as she danced just out of reach of its deadly claws. But it was a dangerous game, and she knew it. "Go, Kale," she shouted, her voice steady even as the creature loomed closer. "Destroy it now." Kale hesitated for only a moment, his heart pounding with dread. He knew what her distraction would cost, but there was no time to argue, no time to think. He charged forward, his blade gleaming in the eerie light. With a final, desperate strike, he plunged the weapon into the creature's heart. It let out a deafening shriek before collapsing into a heap of ash and shadow. Breathless, Kale turned to Lyra, but his relief was short-lived. She lay on the ground, her breathing shallow, her hand clutching the wound in her side. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he tried to stop the bleeding. "Why?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "Why did you do it?" Lyra managed a faint smile, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of sorrow and resolve. "The runes," she said weakly. "They were never meant to be used, Kale. They were meant to be destroyed. This whole time, we've been chasing the wrong path." Her words hit him like a thunderclap, shaking the very foundation of everything he thought he knew. As her life slipped away, Kale felt a storm of emotions, grief, anger, and a burning determination. He clenched his fists, tears streaming down his face. "I'll finish what we started," he vowed, his voice steady despite the pain. "I'll honor your sacrifice. I'll destroy the runes." With trembling hands, he reached for the third rune, its surface glowing faintly in the dim light. But as his fingers closed around it, a surge of energy coursed through him, more intense than anything he'd ever felt. The power was intoxicating, overwhelming, and for a moment, he felt invincible. But then the darkness crept in, a cold, insidious force that whispered promises of dominion and control. Kale gritted his teeth, fighting to hold on to himself. He had a mission now, a purpose greater than himself. But as the rune's power began to consume him, he couldn't help but wonder, would he be strong enough to resist its pull, or would it destroy him before he could destroy it? Kale stumbled back into his village, his once strong frame now hunched under the weight of the rune's unrelenting whispers. The voices were no longer distant murmurs, but a cacophony that echoed in his mind, clawing at his thoughts and twisting his resolve. His hands trembled as he clutched his staff, the runes etched into its surface, glowing faintly, a reminder of the power he had so desperately sought. But now, that power felt like a curse, a chain binding him to forces he could barely comprehend. The village he had left behind was unrecognizable. Homes lay in ruins, their charred remains a testament to the invaders' relentless assault. The air was thick with smoke and the cries of the wounded, and the once bustling streets were eerily silent, save for the distant clang of swords and the crackle of flames. Kale's heart ached as he saw the faces of those he had sworn to protect, faces now etched with fear and despair. As the invaders closed in, their war cries echoing through the village, Kale felt the runes stir within him, their energy surging like a storm. He raised his staff, the runes flaring to life, and called upon their power. A blinding light erupted from the ground, and with a deafening roar, the earth itself seemed to rise against the attackers. They were thrown back, their ranks shattered, their weapons reduced to ash. The villagers watched in awe and terror as Kale unleashed the rune's might, their savior transformed into something otherworldly. But the victory came at a cost. The rune's power drained Kale, leaving him weak and trembling. More than that, he saw the fear in the eyes of his people. Fear not of the invaders, but of him. They backed away, their whispers filled with suspicion and dread. "What has he become?" they murmured. "Is he still one of us?" Kale's heart sank as he realized the truth. In his quest to protect them, he had become the very thing he feared, a force of destruction, a being no longer fully human. The weight of his choices pressed down on him, heavier than the runes themselves. He had wielded their power to save his village, but at what cost? The runes had changed him, and he could feel their grip tightening, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. He knew he couldn't stay. The villagers needed protection, but they no longer needed him. Not like this. With a heavy heart, Kale made his decision. There was one last rune, a final piece of the ancient puzzle that had brought him to this point. If he could find it, perhaps it would hold the answers he sought. A way to undo the damage he had caused, to free himself from the rune's hold, and to restore the balance he had so carelessly disrupted. But the path ahead was uncertain, and the whispers in his mind warned him of the dangers that lay ahead. Still, he had no choice. He had to try. As he turned away from the village, the runes pulsed faintly, their light casting long shadows across the ravaged land. Kale took a deep breath, steeling himself for the journey to come. He didn't know what awaited him, but one thing was certain. The final rune would either be his salvation or his undoing. The path to the mountain was unlike anything Kale had ever faced. It rose before him, a jagged silhouette clawing at the sky, wrapped in a tempest that never ceased. Lightning split the air, and the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls. This was no ordinary storm. It was alive, ancient, and unforgiving. The runes at his side, once a source of unyielding power, flickered weakly, their light dimming with each step. Kale realized, with a sinking feeling, that he could no longer rely on their magic alone. The mountain demanded something more, something raw and human. As he climbed, the storm seemed to mirror the turmoil within him. Every step brought a new wave of exhaustion. Every gust of wind felt like a taunt. The air grew thinner, and the cold bit deeper, but it was the visions that truly tested him. Lyra's face appeared in the mist, her eyes filled with both sorrow and accusation. He saw the faces of those he couldn't save, their voices echoing in the wind, a relentless reminder of his failures. They whispered doubts he could barely silence, questions that gnawed at his resolve. Was he truly worthy of the rune's power, or had he been chasing a destiny he was never meant to fulfill? The higher he climbed, the heavier the weight became, not just of the mountain, but of the choices he had made. The runes, once his greatest allies, now felt like a burden, their power slipping through his fingers like sand. He had to rely on his own strength, his own will, to keep moving forward. It was a humbling realization, one that forced him to confront the limits of what he thought he could endure. But Kale pressed on, driven by a determination that even the storm couldn't extinguish. At last, he reached the summit. The storm seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. There, in the center of a ring of jagged stones, lay the final rune. Its light pulsed faintly, a heartbeat in the darkness. But before Kale could reach for it, a figure emerged from the shadows, a being of pure light, radiant and ethereal. Its voice was both soothing and stern, echoing with the weight of countless ages. "You have come far, Kale," it said, "but the final rune is not a prize to be claimed. It is a test. To wield it, you must first confront the darkness within yourself." The words struck him like a blow. He had faced countless enemies, overcome unimaginable odds, but this was different. The being stepped aside, and Kale found himself staring into a mirror of light. And there, reflected back at him, was not the hero he believed himself to be, but the shadow of his doubts, his fears, his regrets. It was a version of himself he had tried to bury, a reminder of every mistake, every failure. The being's challenge was clear. To claim the rune, he would have to face this darkness head-on, to accept it as part of who he was. The choice before him was agonizing. The runes had brought him this far, but they had also led him down a path of sacrifice and loss. Did he embrace their power, knowing it came with a cost? Or did he destroy them, freeing himself from their burden, but risking the future they were meant to protect? The storm raged around him, but Kale stood still, his mind a battleground of conflicting thoughts. This was no longer just about destiny. It was about who he was, who he wanted to be, and what he was willing to sacrifice to become that person. The final rune waited, its light flickering like a question, and Kale knew his answer would shape not just his fate, but the fate of the world itself. Kale stood before the radiant being, its light both comforting and overwhelming. The air seemed to hum with energy, as though the very fabric of the world was holding its breath. The being spoke, its voice resonating with a timeless wisdom. "The runes you carry," it began, "were never meant to be instruments of destruction. They were forged as a test, a crucible to reveal the true nature of those who seek power. Their essence is neither good nor evil. It merely amplifies the desires of the one who wields them. Choose wisely, Kale, for your decision will shape not only your fate, but the fate of all who dwell in the shadow of their power." Kale felt the weight of the runes in his hands, their ancient symbols glowing faintly. He thought of his village, of the people who depended on him. Could he use the runes to save them, to heal the land and drive away the darkness that had plagued them for so long? Or would he succumb to the same corruption that had claimed so many before him? The being's words echoed in his mind. Their power is a mirror, reflecting the heart of the one who holds them. The choice seemed impossible. To use the runes risked unleashing their unpredictable influence, but to destroy them meant losing the only tool that might save his people. The being's final warning lingered in the air. Either path demands sacrifice, neither is without cost. Kale's heart raced as he wrestled with the enormity of the decision. His duty to his village clashed with his fear of the rune's potential to corrupt. Could he trust himself to wield such power, Or was it better to let them vanish forever, even if it meant his people might suffer? As he stood there, paralyzed by indecision, a sudden chill swept through the chamber. The light dimmed, and shadows began to creep along the edges of the room. Kale turned, his grip tightening on the runes as the shadowy figures emerged from the darkness. Their presence was suffocating, their eyes gleaming with a hunger that sent a shiver down his spine. They had come for the runes, drawn by their power like moths to a flame. Kale's hesitation was shattered in an instant. The choice was no longer his to make. The shadowy figures had made it for him. The air crackled with tension as Kale faced the encroaching threat. The being of light watched silently, its expression unreadable. In that moment, Kale understood that his path was no longer about choosing between two impossible options. It was about survival, about protecting the runes from those who would use them for darker purposes. His heart pounded as he prepared to confront the shadows, the weight of the runes now a burden and a weapon in equal measure. The test was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. The air crackled with tension as Kale stood alone, surrounded by shadowy figures whose forms seemed to shift and twist like smoke in the wind. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their whispers echoed with a chilling promise: eternal sleep for the world, a slumber from which no one would awaken. These were no ordinary enemies. They were servants of a dark entity, a force that sought to twist the rune's ancient power into a weapon of endless night. Kale gripped the runes tightly, their energy pulsing in his hands like a heartbeat. He knew he had no choice but to fight. The battle erupted in a blinding flash of light and shadow. Kale summoned the rune's power, their energy surging through him as he unleashed bursts of light to push back the encroaching darkness. Each strike was a desperate act of survival, but with every use, he felt the rune's influence growing stronger, more invasive. It was as if the runes were alive, feeding on his fear and desperation, whispering promises of strength, even as they clawed at his soul. The more he relied on them, the more he felt himself slipping, his own will bending under their weight. Then, amidst the chaos, a familiar presence appeared. Lyra's spirit materialized before him, her form glowing softly like moonlight breaking through a storm. Her voice, gentle yet urgent, cut through the noise of the battle. "Kale," she said, her eyes filled with both sorrow and resolve. "The runes are not your salvation. They are a chain, binding you to their will. You must let them go. Trust in yourself, your own strength, your own heart. That is where true power lies." Her words struck him like a thunderclap, shaking him to his core. For the first time, Kale understood the truth. The runes were not a tool, they were a trap. Their power came at a cost, one that would consume him entirely if he continued to wield them. He looked down at the runes in his hands, their glow now tinged with a malevolent hue, and realized what he had to do. To save the world, to honor Lyra's sacrifice, and to reclaim his own soul, he would have to destroy the runes even if it meant destroying himself. With a deep breath, Kale closed his eyes and focused inward, drawing on the strength Lyra had spoken of. It was a strength born not of magic or ancient relics, but of courage, love, and the unyielding will to protect those he cared about. The runes thrummed in his hands, their power surging in protest, but Kale's resolve was unshakable. He would not let them control him any longer. The battle raged on around him, but in that moment, Kale found peace. He was ready to let go. As the dark entity loomed closer, its shadow stretching across the crumbling mountain peak, Kale knew this was his final chance. The runes, glowing faintly in his hands, pulsed with a rhythm that mirrored his racing heartbeat. He closed his eyes, drawing in the last remnants of their ancient energy. The power surged through him, brighter and hotter than ever before, but it came at a cost. Pain ripped through his body, as if his very soul was being torn apart. For a moment, he thought he might collapse, his strength faltering under the weight of the rune's immense power. But he held on, driven by sheer will, and the knowledge that this was the only way to stop the darkness. With a final, desperate cry, Kale channeled all the rune's energy into a single, blinding burst. The light exploded outward, engulfing the dark entity in a searing wave of pure energy. The creature shrieked, its form dissolving into wisps of shadow as the light consumed it, but the victory was bittersweet. As the entity vanished, the runes in Kale's hands cracked and shattered, their ancient power released in a final, radiant explosion. The force of it threw him backward, leaving him sprawled on the ground, broken and gasping for air. For a moment, everything was still. The storm that had raged for so long began to dissipate, the winds dying down and the clouds parting to reveal a pale, fragile light. But the mountain itself was not so fortunate. The ground beneath Kale trembled violently, great chunks of rock breaking away and tumbling into the abyss below. He struggled to his feet, his body aching and his vision blurred, but he knew he couldn't stay. With the last of his strength, he stumbled forward, dodging falling debris as he made his way down the crumbling path. The rune's power was gone, their magic spent in the final battle. Kale felt their absence like a hollow ache, a part of him forever changed. His hands, scarred and trembling, bore the marks of their influence, but his mind was finally free. The weight of their prophecies, their demands, their endless pull on his life. It was over. He was no longer their vessel, no longer bound to their will. As he reached the base of the mountain, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm, golden light over the land. Kale paused, looking back at the peak, now crumbling into dust. He had paid a heavy price, but the world was safe, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt something he had almost forgotten: peace. Kale stepped back into his village, but the man who returned was not the same one who had left. His eyes carried the weight of the world, and his heart held the echoes of ancient prophecies whispered by the runes. The villagers, once familiar faces, now regarded him with a mix of curiosity and unease. They could sense the change in him, a quiet strength, a tempered wisdom that set him apart. It was as if the very air around him hummed with the lessons of his journey, and they weren't sure whether to welcome him or keep their distance. At first, the distrust was palpable. Whispers trailed behind him as he walked through the village square. Was he truly one of them, or had the runes claimed him in some way? Kale understood their hesitation. He had been gone for so long, and the scars of the past still lingered. But instead of pushing for acceptance, he chose to listen. He sat with the elders, shared meals with families, and spoke openly about his journey, not as a hero, but as someone who had failed and risen again. He spoke of the runes, not as objects of power, but as symbols of the dangers that come with imbalance and pride. Slowly, the villagers began to see him in a new light. They noticed how he worked alongside them in the fields, how he rebuilt the broken fences and mended the cracks in their community. Kale didn't demand their trust. He earned it, one small act at a time. He introduced new ways of thinking, teaching them to value harmony over dominance, humility over arrogance. The village began to transform, not through force, but through the quiet ripple of shared understanding. The runes themselves were gone, their power dissipated, but their lessons remained etched into Kale's soul. He often gathered the villagers around the fire at night, recounting the tales of his journey, the trials, the sacrifices, the moment he realized that true power lies not in control, but in balance. These stories became a part of the village's fabric, passed down from one generation to the next. Kale knew that the legacy of the runes had to endure, not as a warning of destruction, but as a reminder of the choices that shape destiny. One evening, as the stars painted the sky, Kale stood before a group of young villagers. Their eyes sparkled with curiosity, their hearts unburdened by the weight of the past. He saw in them the potential for a brighter future, one where the mistakes of the past could be avoided. "The runes taught me that power is fleeting," he said, his voice steady and warm. "But wisdom, when shared, becomes eternal. I will teach you how to guard not just this village, but the balance of all things." And so, Kale began to train a new generation of guardians. He taught them not just the skills of survival, but the values of empathy, humility, and respect for the delicate threads that connect all life. The village, once fractured by fear and mistrust, began to heal. The legacy of the runes lived on, not in their power, but in the stories and lessons that shaped a community. Kale's journey had come full circle, and though the road ahead was uncertain, he knew that the seeds of wisdom he had planted would grow, ensuring that the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. Years flowed like a river, carrying Kale from the fiery trials of his youth into the steady rhythms of leadership. His people revered him, their trust unwavering, yet beneath the surface of his composed demeanor, a storm of memories churned. The weight of his journey, the sacrifices, the losses, the fleeting triumphs never truly left him. Lyra's absence lingered like a shadow, a quiet ache that time could not heal. Often he found himself drawn to her grave, a place of quiet reflection where the world seemed to hold its breath. On one such visit, as the sun dipped low and cast long, golden rays across the earth, Kale noticed something strange. Near the base of Lyra's headstone, the ground shimmered faintly, as if touched by starlight. Kneeling, he brushed away the soil to reveal a small, glowing shard, a fragment of the runes he had fought so hard to destroy. It pulsed softly, its light steady yet alive, as though it carried a heartbeat of its own. The sight of it sent a shiver through him, stirring emotions he had long tried to bury. For a moment, he was frozen, caught between two instincts. Part of him wanted to crush the shard, to obliterate this last remnant of the runes and the chaos they had wrought. Yet another part, quieter but no less insistent, urged him to preserve it, not as a relic of power, but as a testament to all that had been lost and gained. It was a piece of the past, a fragment of Lyra's sacrifice, and perhaps even a symbol of the fragile hope they had fought to protect. In the end, Kale chose neither destruction nor preservation. Instead, he took the shard and carried it deep into the forest, far from the eyes of the world. There, beneath the roots of an ancient oak, he buried it, pressing it into the earth with reverence and resolve. It was a choice born of wisdom and weariness, a decision to let the past rest, not forgotten, but no longer a burden to carry. The shard's light faded as it disappeared beneath the soil, leaving only the stillness of the forest and the quiet resolve in Kael's heart. As he walked away, the weight of his memories felt a little lighter, as if the earth itself had taken some of the burden. The shard was hidden now, a secret known only to him and the land that cradled it. And though the rune's power was gone, their legacy remained not in the glow of a shard, but in the strength of those who had risen to face their destiny. As the shard of the ancient rune glowed faintly in Kael's trembling hands, a cold dread seeped into his chest. The artifact, long buried and forgotten, now pulsed with a faint, ominous energy, a reminder of a darkness he had hoped to never face again. His mind raced with memories of the last battle, the chaos, the lives lost, and the sacrifices made. Though years had passed, the scars of that time had never fully healed. Kale was no longer the reckless young warrior he once was. Age had tempered him, wisdom had reshaped his heart, but the fear of failure still lingered like a shadow. He called upon his new guardians, a group of young warriors he had taken under his wing. Each of them carried a spark of potential, but Kale knew potential alone wasn't enough. The dark entity they faced thrived on chaos, on the unchecked emotions that could turn even the strongest wills against themselves. As they gathered around him, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease, Kale began to share not just the techniques of combat, but the lessons of balance. Strength without control, he warned, is a weapon that can cut both ways. I've seen it happen. I've lived it, and I won't let you fall into the same trap. Training sessions became more than physical drills. Kale taught them to meditate, to center their thoughts, to find clarity even in the heat of battle. He showed them how fear could cloud judgment, how anger could be a fire that consumes rather than fuels. The runes we protect, he said one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, are more than symbols of power. They are reminders of what we stand to lose if we let ourselves be ruled by impulse. Balance is the key, not just in battle, but in life. The weight of his past decisions bore heavily on him, especially when he looked at his young guardians. He saw in them the same determination he'd once carried, the same hunger to prove themselves. But this time, he was determined to guide them differently, to ensure they understood the cost of their actions before it was too late. As the days passed and the signs of the dark entity's return grew clearer, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that this battle would test not just their strength, but their resolve. And deep down, he knew the greatest challenge would be his own, to lead without faltering, to protect without losing himself. The air grew heavy, thick with an oppressive energy that seemed to pulse from the very ground beneath Kale's feet. The dark entity, once a distant threat, now loomed over them like a storm about to break. Kale felt its presence like a weight pressing against his chest, each breath harder than the last. And then it struck him. The shard he had carried, the one he thought would save them, was no mere relic. It was a fragment of the entity itself, a piece of its essence, feeding it power from within their world. The realization sent a chill through him, but there was no time for hesitation. This was the moment they had prepared for, the final stand. With a steadying breath, Kale raised his hand, the runes etched into his skin, glowing faintly. He called to his guardians, their faces a mixture of fear and determination, as they formed a circle around him. The runes on their armor flickered to life, a network of ancient symbols weaving a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. Kale's voice cut through the chaos, calm and commanding, as he began to chant the words of power. Each syllable pulled at the entity's strength, weakening its hold on the shard. The ground trembled, the sky above churning with unnatural light, but Kale held firm. He knew the cost, and he was ready to pay it. The battle that followed was unlike anything they had faced before. Shadows twisted and lunged, their forms shifting faster than the eye could follow. The guardians fought with everything they had, their weapons cutting through the darkness, but the entity was relentless. Kale's runes flared brighter with every strike, their light burning through the shadows, but the toll was immense. Blood seeped from wounds that wouldn't close, his strength waning with each passing moment. Yet he didn't falter. With a final desperate surge of energy, he reached for the shard, its surface cracking under the force of his will. The entity screamed, a sound that seemed to tear through the fabric of reality itself, and then silence. Kale collapsed, the shard crumbling to dust in his hands. The connection was severed, the entity's presence fading like smoke on the wind. His guardians rushed to his side, their voices a distant echo as his vision blurred. And then, through the haze, he saw her, Lyra. Her spirit stood before him, radiant and serene, her hand outstretched as if to guide him home. A smile touched his lips, the weight of a lifetime's battles lifting from his shoulders. He had done what he set out to do. The world was safe, at least for now. As his eyes closed for the last time, his guardians knelt beside him, their grief tempered by resolve. They had lost their leader, but his legacy would endure. They would see to it that the rune's power was never again misused, that the darkness he had fought so hard to banish would remain at bay. And as they carried his body from the battlefield, the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, a quiet reminder that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, there was always the promise of light. And so, Kale's journey, once a tale of hope and peril, transforms into something timeless, a legend whispered around campfires and shared in hushed tones by storytellers. His name becomes a symbol, not just of courage, but of the weight that comes with power. The villagers, once fearful and uncertain, now live in harmony, guided by the wisdom of Kale's chosen guardians. These protectors, shaped by his sacrifice, carry forth his vision of balance, ensuring that the lessons of the past are never forgotten. The runes, those ancient symbols of destiny, may have vanished, but their absence speaks louder than their presence ever could. They remind us that power, no matter how great, must always be tempered by humility. The world, though at peace, still holds traces of the shadows that once threatened to consume it, a quiet echo of the eternal dance between light and darkness. It's a reminder that even in times of calm, the choices we make ripple far beyond our own lives. Kale's legacy isn't just a story of triumph, it's a mirror held up to us all. What would we do with such power? How would we wield it? And perhaps more importantly, what would we sacrifice to protect what truly matters? His tale lingers, not as a relic of the past, but as a living lesson, one that continues to shape the hearts and minds of those who hear it. The shadows may linger, but so does the light, ever present, ever guiding.